Hello, this is Lecture 1 from MS 2900 Exploring Media Theory. This is the pre-recorded version of the lecture. So today I want to look at some of the key themes that we're going to encounter on the module and introduce some of the key concepts. There's lots of ways of looking at the media, and media studies historically was a field rather than an actual discipline. By field I mean it was an area of study that different disciplines would come in and study from different approaches. Media communications, which is the more contemporary version of media studies, is similar in that, and it's studied by lots of different academic disciplines. And historically we can kind of group these disciplines into three main areas. We might call them the social sciences, the humanities and the arts. Now at the University of Winchester we consider the media primarily from a social scientific perspective, but also with aspects of the humanities. And the reason we do this is because staff have different particular approaches to studying it. But it is worth remembering that it's primarily for us here a social scientific approach with little bits of the humanities in there. Now social sciences are different from natural sciences and slightly different from the arts and humanities. Now in a normal lecture I'd ask you to spend 2 minutes working through this, but we'll skip beyond that bit here. Now social sciences study human action. For example, psychology studies the way in which individual minds work. It looks at the drives and the impulses and the way in which the individual mind encounters the world. Sociology similarly studies collective action and looks at social phenomena in modern societies, how groups operate together. Politics, for example, looks at the exercise of power in human societies. Who's got power, how do they maintain it, and how do they use it? Economics looks at the exchange of what we might term tokens, or what we might term money in our society. Whereas history, as a social science, tends to study the trajectory of social development. Now most of these agree that there is a form of collective action and meaning to our actions. We cannot explain human action away just by looking at internal drives and motivations. We live and we act in a social world, and we ascribe value to things we do and the interactions we have with others. And we call this kind of collective human action culture. Now there's lots of different definitions of culture, and it's one of those perennial terms in the humanities and social sciences, and in fact you'll probably find at least 30 different specific meanings for culture. We often use it to refer to the best that a society has produced, or we might use it to refer to all the action of a society. For our purposes, we understand culture as a form of collective behaviour of a group of people. However, defining such groups tends to be very tricky. So we might say British culture is this, or American culture is this, or Russian culture is this. Or we might turn around and we might sort of like say gay culture operates in this way, or another form of culture is in this way. But in doing so we're defining people by a particular group, and that can get very tricky. So where should we look? Should we look at nationality? Should we say all people from a particular society have the same culture? Are we talking about geography? What about geography that spans 2 or 3 different countries? So we say British society, but in there you've got Welsh, English and Scottish society. Some people would say, well, you need to look at race. You might look at ethnicities. Again, these are very, very problematic ideas. You might say there's such a thing as working class culture or middle class culture. You might say women as a collective group behave differently from men, and so on. But all these ways of thinking put boundaries upon how we understand it. We also need to remember that culture is constantly shifting and changing. The culture we have today is quite different from the culture we may have had 30 or 50 or 100 years ago. So what stays the same? Is it the geography that keeps things the same, or do things evolve? These are big questions that some of the perspectives we study on this course will endeavour to answer. And the media play a major part in the transmission and reproduction of culture, And that's the bit that we study on this course, an acoustic higher degree. To what aspect does the media play a part in reproducing culture? Now, of course, culture is treated differently by different academic perspectives. In the study of culture, the humanities tends to focus upon texts, to try and interpret what texts mean and what understanding we can gain about the wider social world from the study of texts. So if you're looking at English literature, you'll read the canonical texts and try and understand how they contribute to Western society. In film studies, you look at certain films and understand how they contribute and how they explain our society. Now, subjects within the arts tend to concentrate on a slightly different area, and they concentrate upon how we actually make texts and how we learn to be a practitioner. Now, for us, the social sciences are less so. We are more interested in why and how texts mean what they do. So the social sciences, arts and humanities all engage with and study culture, but they do it in many different ways. Now, we study the media with the understanding that it's part of culture. And we would argue quite clearly that the media carries and reproduces the values of a culture. But because it's human-made and we give it meaning, we can't simply study it from a scientific perspective. Now, of course, lots and lots of people have tried to use scientific methods to study the media. There are problems with that. We can't treat the media and culture as a fixed thing that we can grasp and analyse and use scientific experiments upon that. We would argue that it's slightly more subtle and needs a different toolkit for that. And together, this module and the other module in methodologies in this study of the media will kind of hopefully open your eyes to this approach. Now, engaging with the media, we are looking at very fluid issues, such as meaning. So we might be asking, what do texts mean? What do texts mean to different people? How can two people watching the same thing get a different interpretation or have a different understanding? There's the idea of an intended meaning within a text, something that the producer puts into the text, hopefully saying this is what I've made and this is what it means. But watching a text, can we get different meanings from that? How is meaning made? How are the ideas communicated across? And the other idea is, do the people who make these texts, do they have power? Do they have power over us? Can they corral off certain meanings and make us think certain things? Now, because these are human issues, there are many different perspectives on this topic. Now, within the social, scientific and humanities study of the media, there's alternate readings and theories of why the human world is as it is. And in this course, we're going to look at a number of these perspectives. So if I go back a little bit to the start of the lecture, I talked about different ways of studying culture. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the arts, which is about the making of culture. You've got the humanities, which is about studying what culture means and so on. And you've got the social sciences, which is about studying how meaning is made and how it's communicated and how power operates and a number of other things. And within the social sciences and in the humanities, there's differing perspectives upon actual culture themselves. And that's what this course is about. It's about looking at those different perspectives, different theoretical ways in which we understand the media. So we're going to be looking at a number of different theories to explain the media and its place in reproducing culture and society. Now, within these different things, it's quite hard to understand what we should do with these different theories. Some critics would argue that a particular theory will give you a universal truth. Such things as a Marxist perspective will claim to have discovered a truth about something. And they'll be looking at it, offering you a particular, encompassing, totalising view. There's also critics who combine theoretical perspectives with a political commitment. So I would say, okay, this is how things are, and we use this theory to understand things, but we can also make the world better, and our theory gives us a pathway to an improved world. This is a kind of a progressive approach. And they would argue that no theory is value-free. Some of the theories we look at will be treated as if they're kind of value-free, objective positions. Other theoretical positions turn around and say there is no such thing as objectivity in the study of culture. Everything is value-led. So some theories say they are value-free, and some theories say there can be no value-free theories, and instead everything has a political dimension to it. A third approach, which is quite a pragmatic one, says theories are different, almost like toolkits, and you can take bits from one theory and take bits from another theory and use them both together to understand particular phenomena or particular problems. So we've got three distinct ways of looking at it, and you'll find examples of all of those in the theories that we approach on this course. Now, another point to remember is that the theories, of course, emerged from people who were living during a particular time and going through particular experiences. So every media theory really reflects the society and the historical times in which it was first developed. To give you a few examples of this, we're going to be studying a theory called mass society theory, and that very much reflects the concerns and worries of the late 19th century and early 20th century. It reflects the values and beliefs of a group of people who felt the world was changing too much. They saw things changing around them and they wanted to understand them. So they developed a theory to explain the world and explain the role of the media in that. That's called mass society theory. An opposing theory to that was proposed by Karl Marx, and that was also clearly experienced by late 19th century capitalism, and it was written to try and understand the events of his time. So he was also looking at the world changing and seeing enormous transitions going on. But he was a politically motivated writer, as well as being a very erudite and thoughtful, not sort of journalist, but a reporter of his time. So he was looking around and finding things to do, but he also offered a way forwards, a perspective forwards. Another theory we're going to encounter is feminism, and this articulates a woman's position in society as they experienced it, and it's clearly very much influenced by women's experience of men over time. We'll move on to theories of late capitalism and postmodernism, and how these reflect the experience of the USA and Europe in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Now, more recently, we've got new theories emerging, such as network theory and theories of post-capitalism. Now, these are partly a reflection of the experience of more recent developments. So, for example, the 2007-2008 financial crash and the continuing economic crisis, what's termed austerity, has deeply influenced how these people understand the world. We've also got the proliferation of digital technologies and of social media, and the rise of new kinds of political action, such as Donald Trump, Brexit, and new forms of political opposition. And all these kind of things are factored into network theory and theories of post-capitalism. Now, I talked roughly a bit there, but I also want to bring in some concepts which you can use to actually consider these theories and to try and use them as kind of compare and contrast these different theoretical approaches using these points. So you need to ask critical questions about what each theory either openly or implicitly assumes. And theories are likely to make assumptions to do with the following concept. Now, it's important to realise that not every concept is relevant to every theory. Some theories really push some aspects of it and ignore others, while other ones do likewise for different approaches. So the first area I wanted to look at is the idea of the macro and the micro. So sociology, so the social sciences, that's sociology, economics, psychology, media theory, and often distinguish between what we call macro level accounts and micro level accounts. Now, a macro level account is where we look at the level of society or big social structures, big phenomena in society. So things like social classes, capitalism, patriarchy, nations, the economy. We're talking about big structures that affect us. There's another way of looking at the world, which is where we talk about micro-level things. So here we're looking at the level of analysis of individuals, of personal relationships, of small groups, and of social practices. So we're looking at how individuals interact with each other, what are the practices and traditions and beliefs that we have in small groups. Now sometimes there's a middle level account which is called a meso level, and this is mentioned to refer to things between the macro and the micro. So we might use to refer to this as things like institutions such as companies, film studios, or even universities. And different theories assume one level or the other is more important, or at least more important as a starting point. So, to give you a couple of examples. Would an analysis of family viewing explain how TV industries work? Well, here you're looking at a micro level thing to try and explain a more meso level thing. Be problematic. Similarly, would an examination of how Facebook generates income, which is at the meso level, possibly towards the macro, would that be helpful to understand how people present themselves on Facebook? Now, different theoretical perspectives might operate at the micro, that'll be down there, the meso or the macro. And they will all offer us different ways in which we can understand individual action and culture and so on. So it's important to try and realise that different theories are good for examining different things, but they all also operate at different levels of account. Another big debate that's gone in sociology and a number of disciplines over recent years is the idea of structure and action. This is also very relevant to media theory. So the big problem is, do big social structures determine how social actors behave, or at least set out options for them? Are we driven by, say, our class position? We might consider ourselves middle class or working class or so on. And those class positions will be very macro level things, but do they determine how I behave on an individual basis? I mean, do they determine how I speak? Do they determine how I interact with my friends and family? Or are we, social actors, capable of acting on and shaping the social world? Do we have agency in the face of these large social structures? Can we do things that are outside of our expected forms of behaviour? We get then onto another area, which is kinds of determinism. Different theories sometimes assume that different forces determine our behaviour. And determinism has been quite a popular way of understanding things. So we tend to talk about technological determinism. And any time you see an account that says, smartphones are damaging children's behaviour or causing kids to behave in a certain way, that's a kind of technological determinism. We believe that technology is causing us to behave in a particular way. We've also got economic determinism, or relationships to social classes. We might say people behave in a certain way because they come from a particular social class. They might have certain interests because they're middle class, or they might have certain interests because they're working class. So that would be an economic determinism. You then might have an idea of biological determinism, saying, and this is often used in terms of people's sex. So you might say women will behave in a particular way and men will behave in another way. So they're saying the biology of a person determines their actual behaviour. And then you've got things like cultural or nationalist determinism. People will say someone behaves in a certain way because they come from a particular group, and their culture assumes that their culture makes them behave in that way, or their nationality makes them behave in that way. So these are cultural or nationalist determinist positions. And this of course feeds into theories which we might term essentialist. Now this is an odd way of saying it. So if you're saying that someone behaves in a certain way because of some feature about them, you're saying the essence of that person determines how they're going to behave. So it might be their class, it might be their ethnicity, it might be their gender. And you're saying the essence of the person causes them to behave in this way. And essentialism is often sort of like seen as a bit of a criticism of particular theories. Well, the picture you can see on the screen there, that's a young man. His name is James Danmore, and he works at Google, and he recently came out with a kind of a big statement that he published under Google, and he says women are biologically less able to code, and that's why women shouldn't be given the jobs within Google, and Google's attempt to try and be more equal is actually damaging the coding community and so on. So he was saying there's a biological aspect to a person's ability to perform a particular job function beyond physical strengths and so on. And he says men have got certain qualities and women have got certain qualities. That seems quite a crude interpretation. That's a very good example of a biological essentialism. Similarly, when you get comments that just scratch away the surface and you find that all men are lazy and brutish and selfish, and you get an approach to genders that reduces genders down to a particular set of behaviours. All these explanations for particular behaviour, they are essentialist and determinist. Now, alternative theories often assume that human nature is fluid, changeable and shaped by culture. We're not driven by what we're born into or born as, but we get more choice in the matter. So that's quite a tricky area to look at. And then we go on to kind of like larger issues here again. So you've got different perspectives. So you've got what we term social constructionists and social realists. Now, social constructionists emphasise the extent to which society is socially constructed. We interact, exchange meaning and create shared understandings, and that's what we call society. And they would argue that all meaning and all understanding is a result of social construction. There is no real meaning to anything above what we give to it. An opposing view comes from what's termed social realists, and they assume that there are real social structures independent of how we think, so class and so on, and they will constantly reinforce themselves onto our behaviour. The social structures exist and influence how we behave, and we can never escape such powerful systems. There's another school of thought which is called post-structuralism, and these are extreme social constructionists, and they don't assume the real existence of any social structures or of anything. Things are only constituted through language or through discourse. And what's more, we can't actually even think outside of language. You can't have a thought that doesn't involve a word. So the language we've got actually structures the way in which we're able to interact and the way in which we can think about the world. The language is slippery and constantly changing, which means that so also are our identities and social arrangements. And this explains why social culture is able to change and evolve over time. We've got on to another area called materialism and idealism. Now, where do ideas come from and how does the world change? And are we able to dream up ideas and then act upon them to change the world, kind of idealism, or does the material environment in which we live shape the ideas that we actually have? So do we create the world by thinking about it, or is the world out there and somehow structures what we can actually think about? Or in other words, does consciousness determine being, our thoughts, or does being determine consciousness, materialism? Does our presence in the world determine where we are, or consciousness determine what we understand about the world? These are tricky ideas, so don't worry too much in the moment. We'll come to them again and again as we go through the course. Now, all these kind of positions are not really binary, and actually the way media work in society are very complex and messy. So think of all these concepts as each end of a continuum. The truth is somewhere in the middle, so you might think something like that one we talked about a moment ago about idealism, materialism as two ends, and what's probably going on is somewhere in the middle there. Now, often we can act and shape the world to an extent, but only within the limits of, or the boundaries of, the particular social structures we work in. So these are the concepts that you can use to interrogate the theories we'll look at on the module. There's not really a checklist of questions to ask, but you'll begin to see time and again the different theories will have a particular approach to something. And you kind of need to begin to ask yourself, as we go through the different theories for each week, what does each theory assume about these issues? Well, these are some of the kind of things that we'll talk about next week in the seminar. So thank you very much for watching.